We're trying to keep the program on schedule. It's just a little bit after 6:30 right now. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight. I'm going to try to make my remarks as brief as possible. Let me just say that I've been working on this story a lot of years. I I got interested in history, and especially the history of LCO, probably back in the late 60s. I was in college then, and there certainly was a lot of material. There was a tremendous amount of family oral history on our reservation. Folks, we got electricity on our reservation right around 1960, somewhere in there. I remember it coming to our place in 1960. And what happened after 1960 was a tragedy in itself, because prior to 1960, in my memories, families really stuck together. Families, the extended families, would get together quite often, and they shared a lot of the history. And our reservation was rich with history. We had a tremendous amount of data, information. Some of it, that oral history was very reliable. I could go around the reservation, and I did. I went all over the reservation and interviewed folks who were born in the 1800s. And so I had an active interest, and I was making the rounds, and I knew from 1970 that the story of Pakwewang was indeed, one of the real giant stories of this whole entire region, because there were just a host of agencies and corporate interest. I mentioned American capitalists. There were riparian interests, because folks back then, think about it, nationwide or worldwide, electricity had just come into existence in the late 1800s. And so what was happening, people were looking for the most cost-efficient way to generate power through generators. And one of the best ways, of course, they had generators on Niagara Falls, and they had it everywhere in major rivers. And the rivers that were rapid were the most that were of prime interest. So folks, before the turn of the century at Lakota, we had this myriad river that looked like this. And it came to a point down near Winter, Wisconsin. And folks, that river had tributaries all over the place. And you folks know that up here in northern Wisconsin, we're the result of massive glaciation, and we have, just tremendous giant hills that go up well over 1,000. I forget the numbers, but we have tremendous hills. And our hill right there east of Reserve, for example, between Reserve and New Post, is the highest hill. It's the third highest hill in the whole Sawyer County, and Sawyer County is one of the biggest counties. So folks, what happened was we had people who were still ripe with that story about the tragedy of the Winter Dam. And people back in the 50s, I remember people talking rapidly about what tragic circumstances took our tribe back in the early 1920s. And so what I did was I traveled around the reservation, and I did a series of articles on all of our villages, our major villages. I went way back into history with a lot of these folks. As I look around the room, I see people sitting here who are the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of these people. And I see you, and I can just see their faces. I could go on with a list and list. And one of the things that the offspring of these people who lived in Old Post. They're sitting mingled over here, and I look out in the audience and I see several out there too. But they've retained that history. They've held on to it. And they had vibrant great-grandparents. Before electricity times, they had people who were harboring those stories and hanging on to them. And they were hanging on to their genealogy records. And folks, they're passing these down to their grandchildren and their children. And folks, all over the reservation, you could cross-reference a lot of these stories and accounts. So our reservation is a place that's rich, ripe with history. And tonight we're going to benefit from the testimony of people today who are the descendants of the people who gave testimony back in 1916 down here south of us in Reserve. Testimony that was damning to the Wisconsin-Minnesota Light and Power Company. And folks, the testimony is damnable. And when you read it, and I should mention that Sylvia Bracklin over here, seated at this table, she's now archiving and she's recording a lot of that history. And she's working with Faith Smith, and I don't know where Faith, here you are here. Faith Smith, who is the director of the LCO Museum and Information Center at Kinnaman. And folks, what we have there is a vibrant resource that is collecting historical records for our tribe. And I should mention also Carol Paff with the university, or at the Library University, and she's been most helpful over the years. I don't know how many years Carol goes back with us, but she's done a tremendous job. Folks, we need to archive this information and get our students engaged in writing those histories. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to share some of these stories and accounts. And I think it's just tremendous that we've had some of the descendants of those notable landmark people who really shared those histories with their grandchildren and also with me. I'm very thankful. I was up there with their grandparents and their great-grandparents snooping around, you know, back in, and even with John Anderson and many other folks up in New Post and in other places, Chief Lake and places like that. Folks, what we forget is that Chief Lake was a vibrant community at one time too, before the dam. There was a small pond, it was a small lake at Chief Lake back then that was connected through Tyner with the Chippewa River. And friends, we had houses down there close to the lake. We had cemetery with graves. We had a very long Medewan medicine lodge down there that was running crisscross across that land. All of that got flooded. And we just talk about tragedy after tragedy. Scott Lake was another lake that hasn't been mentioned very much. But we've had people who lived along that riverway, along the streams. I mentioned, took my hand like this, but this is really what it looks like on a map. And what happened was when they went out and surveyed that reservoir in 1908, folks, they did a geologic survey and they made an estimate of all of the property that would be flooded, and it was right around 14,600 acres of land, both tribal and some off reservation. But think about it, well over 5,000 of our tribal lands where most of our people were living along the riverways, and they were getting chased out. And what could we do about it? What was our defense? You know, there wasn't much we could do about it, just like during the treaties. most of our people spoke Ojibwe. And they were really at the mercy of these conglomerate interests, you know, the riparian interests like the Chippewa Flambeau uh, corporation that was buying up lands by the thousands of acres because they could make a profit off of that. And think about that, friends. It was way back in the teens, you know, it was over 100 years ago that they were doing this. So they had the foresight. Once the geological survey was done, they knew where those lands were that were going to be flooded. And so they went about purchasing the lands, and the agency that was responsible for protecting the interests of the Lekudere tribe and all other tribes in America, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had the trust interest of our tribe as their primary purpose of existence. And what did they do? Well, folks, since the 1870s, they had been making avenues for land interest and lumber barons to gobble up our property on our reservation. And today, what are we? We're a checkerboard reservation as a result because we've lost much of our land due to the lumbering interest. Folks, in the 1850s and 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were lumber barons all over Wisconsin. And the upper half of our state was just being gobbled up of all these huge trees, these huge white pine trees that had a diameter about the size of your table. Think about that. Look at that diameter. That was the size of our pine trees on our reservation. And friends, the value of that land, we lost over 8 billion board feet of prime white pine timber. And what were they doing? They were pushing those big logs down the river south along the Lekudere River, along the Red Cedar River, along the Chippewa River. And folks, they were making millions and millions of dollars off of private resources. And, you know, when you look at all of this that's going on with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, whose major interest was exterminating Indian reservations, they really were playing at the heart of the people who wanted our property and the 380 some reservations that were located all over the United States. You know, we were the first of the tribes that had a dam built, and our dam was built right after all the lobbying interest who had a conspiracy, you know, working with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, working with the power companies, working with the bankers and the lumber barons. All of those were in cahoots to rob us of our land. And what the Bureau of Indian Affairs wanted to do was consolidate us and move us west. They had a plan to move us to White Earth Reservation. So what do you think life would be like if we lived at White Earth today? You know, they almost got us there, but thank God we had an intervention in 1873 that finally got our reservation surveyed. Nonetheless, we're here tonight, friends, to look back in time 100 years ago and look at the heartbreak of the people who were forced to move out. I mentioned that there was a survey done in 1908. There was the state legislature passed a law in 1911 to authorize the building of dams on the Chippewa River. Now, folks, the Chippewa River was an active river for those huge logs I was mentioning, and they had 150 check dams. And those check dams were just basically made out of posts and wood. And the check dams were really holding power to keep the logs, you know, at a safe spot for the season to end. And, you know, all these things were happening against our interest. We had the treaty, Article 11 of the Treaty of 1854, that protected us, that guaranteed us that nobody would ever come in and take our lands away. It said in the treaty, Article 11, the interest and the resources of the tribe will be preserved forever. So that was our guarantee that nobody would ever bother us. Yet here it was, 40 years later, that they were already looking for ways to get our land away from us. And there was very little that we could do because we just didn't have attorneys back then. We didn't have anybody that was really interested in protecting our interests. And we were really at the mercy of the English language, as well. So these are some things that went against our interest. In 1916, in the summer, they held the first meeting between the citizens of the people that would be affected by the new reservoir. And they held it down in reserve down here. And folks, you'd be surprised. As I look around this room, I know some of your genealogy, and I know that your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents were there at that meeting in 1916. And Sylvia over here knows their names, and she's got their testimony. And folks, what we're going to hear tonight is testimony coming from these descendants. And thank God it's been preserved in their hearts and in their minds. So this is a tragic circumstance. I remember, sitting with their grandparents. And I remember sitting there and listening to their stories. And one of the stories that I want to leave you with, they closed the gates of the dam in the middle of March. The waters actually start rising at a greater pace in April when the snow was melting. And by May and June, that water was coming up, folks. And it finally reached Pakwewang, the old village there, about in June sometime. And it was getting close. And believe it or not, some of the tribal members there just refused to believe that this was being done to them. Despite all the stories, they still stayed in their cabins. And there was a woman by the name of Pashkin, and she was the daughter of Nanangabi, who I consider our greatest chief who ever lived. And folks, her story was tragic too. She was pushed out of every place she had been. Her children were stolen from her. And she was really at the mercy of everybody around her. And here she finally settled from the Long Lake area south of us up here to the reservation at Pakwewang. And what happened to her there? She refused to go. She was the last person to leave the village. And I see some of you at this table who are direct descendants of her. And folks, she fought with everything she had. And I remember Connie telling the story. And he was almost in tears. He said, us younger boys had to tie her up. We knew she wouldn't leave without a fight. So in order to not hurt her, because she was in her 80s, in order not to hurt her, we just had to bind her and put her in a wagon. And friends, they brought the wagon with a team of horses over along the trail to get out. And what had happened? The water had risen in the gullies, which were at one time, they were just a road that went down lower and then came back up. So they had to unhitch the horses. And they had to tie ropes around the necks of the horses and pull those horses across these filled ravines. And Connie and his brother said to me, both of them said to me, the horses were screaming. For some reason, he said they panicked. And it was the horses that got stressed out. And they didn't tell me this, but their grandsons told me later on, they said probably because they were seeing what was happening to Pashkin. And she was putting up a fight. And so the horses reacted and they put up a fight. And it was just tragic looking back on that account. And so they said that the horses' heads were lurching up out of the water, and the horses' heads were just flailing back and forth, and they were screaming like somebody was killing them. And the men didn't understand it. They were pulling them across. And folks, that story about the village of Pakwewang always sticks with me. And that's what our ancestors went through up there. People don't know the whole story. They only have small pieces of it. But when we look back at that and look at the emotional toll that this had, and friends, this had a great severe emotional toll on the whole tribe. Everybody fought against this. There were 3 meetings that were held. And in those meetings, some of our leaders, our clan heads, and some of our people who were descendants of the chiefs got up, stood up, and they spoke in Ojibwe, but what they told was the history of our tribe and how our people always fought to save this land for us. And it was promised us in the Treaty of 1854. So with that, I'm going to pass on to our descendants and allow them the time now to share this history and the commemoration that we're looking back in remembrance. And I just think that a lot of us put down tobacco today. And I remember the people that I talked to up there and also at Chief Lake. And I remember the heartbreak that they had when they were sharing this story. You know, we look at this 100th anniversary and somebody asked us the question, is that going to be a celebration? No, this is really more of a commemoration or a remembrance of the people who had this heartbreak. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark.
Well, a lot of this stuff I learned from my grandparents, Edwin Tainer, my great uncle, my dad, Henry Smith, and then it went to George Thayer, my dad's father, which was the son of Henry Thayer, and he's the one that married the chief's daughter. And all these stories that I've learned over the past talked a lot about Pakwewang and Old Post, how Thaddeus Thayer built the first road from down by Ojibwa up to the trading post, because the only way for them to bring trading goods in back then was by canoe. And so he cut a road from down by Coudray area all the way up to Old Post. And then he built the road from Old Post to Hayward. And reading some of these documents from my family, I found out that it doesn't really mention my great-great-great-grandfather, Joseph, there as much as they do Thaddeus. Thaddeus was the trading baron. He was also a logging baron back then, but he started getting into the business of trading goods and setting up trading posts. He set up several trading posts throughout the Hayward area up to Teal Lake and Round Lake, a lot of areas that he invested in and sold off in the past. But when it came to Old Post, he had his son, which was Frank also, Frank C. Thayer, I believe. And that's the Thayers that lived by Riverside and up north from where my family lived and live now. But he ran the trading post. And even before the flooding, Pakwewang was there. Like I said, we mentioned about how our family been there for hundreds of years. And I know in some of these stories and some of the work that I've done on the flowage, assisting conservation in the TIPO operations out there. I do survey work, and my brother Jerry Smith was the TIPO for a lot of years for our tribe. So I got to learn a lot with him because I worked with him for about 15 years on the flowage, off and on, when I was conservation. And that's when my interest was really piqued about finding out about our ancestors and our families. So reading some of the books that I've inherited from my father talked about the trading post. And when they built the first church there, one of the first priest that was there was Moneypenny. They built a log cabin there in Old Post, and they turned it into a day school. And that's when our people started to learn English and associate and start to run the trading posts. Well, in this book, it talks about 1912, where the government came in. They were planning. That's when they were planning to start the flooding. They were setting it up. They were making their first meetings. There used to be a Pokegama. There used to be a town hall there. There's Pokegama Lake, which had a creek that went into the Chippewa River, and that's where Pakwewong and our people settled. Well, there's a lake on the other side. Back then it was called Desire Lake, and now we know it as Moonshine. But on that lake, on the shore, there was a town hall that was built, and that's where these lumber barons and these businessmen and these banks met at this trading, or this big building. And that's when they just started talking about flooding the flowage. But it was just talk back then, and no real plans. And well, it was documented because the kids that went there, my great ancestors, were learning to write. So they had the book from the trading post, their logs where they had trading goods and all kinds of information in there. Well, the kids would learn to write, and they were writing their learning to write, and they were writing some of the stories that the people were talking at that meeting. And they were talking about the flooding the flowage. And so that's how I first started learning about that, reading some of these stories. But it had a big effect on, like I said, a lot of our families, and my family especially. And Tom Tainer here, my cousin, they talked about Poskin. Mary Dinasha was a relative of mine too, a great grandmother. She was another one that they had to load up on the wagon because she didn't want to leave Old Post. Again, that was another one. The water was about 2 feet high already, and she didn't want to leave. And the boys had to keep her in the wagon to bring her to New Post area. The thing was, her husband, Henry, we don't know where he's buried out there. He could be on the bottom of the flowage, or there's no mark of him in New Post. So my ancestors are out there somewhere, and that would bring closure for me to, if we could identify where these 700 bodies are still out there. A lot of families. In this book that came from the trading post, it talked about the local people that lived there in Pakwewong and the surrounding area, where they'd come and trade hides and for sugar or coffee. And so there's names written in there from different tribal members that lived in that area. They all suffered this when they flooded the flowage. Like I said, my grandfather, Henry Smith, he was a guide out there after the flooding. And so was my grandpa George there. He talked about, when I came back out of the service, I came to visit him, and he was telling me it was called, the LCO was called the La Corte Orielis, La Corte Orielis. And that's how they taught them to say LCO, La Couture. And he talked about the day school, the boarding schools, and how they took some of our traditions away A lot of them wouldn't, once they went to the boarding schools, they weren't able to practice their traditions because it was beat out of them. They weren't able to speak the language. They weren't able to sing the songs or tell the stories in Ojibwe. I remember my grandpa telling those stories to me, how they lost a lot from these day schools and boarding schools. Well, one of the first ones was at Old Post. It was a day school and then became a boarding school for a little while. And so they told me a lot of those type of stories. But every time I talked to my grandfathers and reading this book, it talked about how our people are one with the land. And that's why we moved with the land. And then we passed on our traditions. A lot of it wasn't written down, and we passed it on word to mouth. And that's how these stories, I was able to gather a lot of this. I mean, you'll hear some other people talk about other elders that couldn't talk about what happened because it hurt too much. They didn't want to have their family know the pain that they went through. There was very few of us that were luckily enough to learn some of these stories from word to mouth. And with that, like I said, there's a lot of history on the flowage, and you see a lot of people do tours out there, and it's they don't mention what actually happened out there when they made the flowage and how many people lost their lives out there or wouldn't go, and how many people are still buried out there. When we, through conservation and some of the other departments, do tours out there and educate the people and some of the younger generations, we talk about that. We show where some of these old homesteads are, where our rice beds were, where Chief Blue Sky lived, where Signagay lived, where some of the burial grounds are on Church Island, and the other ones that are under the water. Next to Church Island, there was an island called Pagan Island. And this was called that back in the day when Moneypenny was there. And it might have been the other, there was another priest that came along in that era when they built the new church. But the ones that attended the day school, they graduated and they were not allowed to speak Ojibwe anymore. And the ones, family members that refused to go to the school and stayed with the traditions, and when these certain people passed away, they buried them on the other island. And back before the flooding, it was just a low spot between these high points of land, and they wouldn't put our traditional people in that cemetery. So they moved them to the other north of their north and east of it. And they called it Pagan Island after the years. And working with conservation, we get a lot of reports of people finding bones out there or coming across a grave, or, and they just don't realize how many people are under it. They always think it's just a lake. It wasn't. It's just rivers in our homeland. So I could go on about our history and our families that been here and some of the things that we've gone through. But for me, firsthand, hearing these stories was a mindset for my goals as getting up in the elder ages to research some of this and be able to pass it on to some of the kids. We were talking about having a museum of Old Post, possibly. Well, some of these stories and some of these photographs could be obtained there, and maybe even have people come and listen to some of these elder stories of what we went through. Tim will have some more stories for you about growing up, not him growing up there, but family growing up out there and how some of the hard times were. Like I mentioned earlier about Jailhouse Island. My family were some of the first police officers out there, from Thaddeus there to his brother Joseph, and then Henry, my great uncle Edwin. But so you could see how times were changing. But then there's the other. When I was being raised by my grandmother on the summertime, Agnes Smith, they dropped me off in this summertime when I was a little boy. And I would sit on the floor and hear stories from her. And she would speak Ojibwe. And she'd tell me stories. And I didn't know how to speak Ojibwe, but I understood it. So I knew the stories she would tell me. A lot of them were happy stories, but then I would ask questions. Well, where did your mom come from? Why didn't I get to meet grandma? Things like that. And then those stories started to come in as far as when I got a little older about how some of them never made it to New Post. Some are still out there on the flowage. So that piqued my interest too, as far as trying to learn our heritage and where some of our people are, and to hang on to our traditions. I mean, that's one of my big goals in my personal growth. So on that, I'm going to pass this on to Tim.
Thank you. My name's Tim DeBuro. I'm the LCO police chief here. I would just like to start out by saying I was in New Post today at the church commemorative, and one part of it was they walked from the church down to the cemetery, which is probably about, I don't know, 2 blocks or so. It's a ways, and it's a little longer when it's cold and nasty out like it was, you know. So, and it kind of reminded me of a tribute, like a pilgrimage, you know. They imitated maybe our ancestors walking from Old Post to New Post. You know, that's what it kind of reminded me of. And 2 or 3 of the walkers were elders, and they were well up into their 80s, maybe 80. I think the oldest one is 86. And that just kind of added to it, you know. Geez, you know, we had elder ancestors that had to make the trip too. And if you didn't own a horse and wagon, you know, you had to walk, carry your stuff, your belongings, and walk. But it kind of reminded me that. And one funny thing that happened, I don't know if Sister Felissa is here or not tonight, but she couldn't walk because of a leg injury, so she was riding in a squad with my officer. And I kind of stayed behind with Sister Mary Rose. She kind of stopped on the road and was resting. And when they came back, my officer stopped by me, and I said, "Who you got on there with you?" I mean, I knew she was on there. And he said, "Sister." He said, "Sister Felissa." I said, "Don't we have warrants for her?" And he goes, "Yeah, we do." He said, so that was kind of comical there. But being in law enforcement, I just want to kind of mention our ancestral law enforcement from Old Post. I got a lot of names from Mark this morning, maybe some dates. Might not be really accurate, but and I might be missing some. But I would just like to name them off and pay a little tribute to them, kind of remember them and thank them for their service to our tribe. I got names from the Post, Old Post, all the way up until the present. So just bear with me a minute. These ones are from late 1800s to maybe mid 1900s. Joseph Thayer, Henry Thayer, Frankie Wabub Thayer, Uncle Billy DeBro, Edwin Tainer, Connie Tainer, Larry Tainer Sr., Dan Goki Sr. And these ones are from probably the 1960s to the present. Louis Gouget Sr., he had a deputy's card. He was working as a constable back then. Roger Diamond, Wayne Corbine, William Morrow, Jim Smith. That's kind of where I jumped in with Sawyer County was with Jim Smith. Michael Villiard, David Aubart. Some of them are tribal members. Some of them have Indian blood, and some of them are from other tribes. James Tate, Cheryl Tate, George Morrow, Philip Chuck Martin, Mark Thayer, Sonny Sunderland, Daryl Coons Jr., Tiger Gouget, Joel Valentine, Janet Quarter, Jake Bisonet, Matt Gabord, John Cleakin, Kaylee Jefferson, Susie Taylor, Henry Bearhart, Aaron DeBro, James Maruka, Jaylena Corbine, Wendell Jefferson, Adam Joe, Jeremy Quagan, and soon to be Victoria Lacapa. I'd just like to tell them all, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for being there. And thank you for being there now. We also have several non-tribal member police officers, and I'd like to thank them also. They're out there, they're busy, they're doing a good job, and hopefully they'll stay with us. What I have here is, for a long time, we were after my grandma, Phyllis DeBro, to write things down as she remembered them. We said, write them down so we have a kind of a booklet. We have, so we know what happened and when. And she finally started doing that. And these are just a few excerpts of what she wrote. 11/17/22, dam was being built. Wisconsin and Minnesota Light and Power Company. Pequayawang means where the river bends. Created the 17,000 acre Chippewa flowage, wild rice beds. Harvested estimate 25,000 pounds per year. 1920 Federal Power Commission. 1921 built new homes at the new site at New Post. June 1924, Congress passed Indian Citizen Act. Granted citizenship to the Indians, stipulating that it not impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian to, I can't understand what she's saying here, but it says to tribal on their property. 1923, all removed to the new village. Pequayawang Camp opened Saturday, June 16th, 1917. Operated until last entry, October 11th, 1922. 2/12 and 1912, engineers arrived to do a survey of Chippewa River. 3/28 of 1912. Her reading is kind of hard. I mean, her writing is kind of hard to read. What it says after that, estimations of survey to the Chippewa River are that Pequayawang Lake will be raised to 23 feet of water above lake level. Chief Lake to be 16 feet over. She's got some of the possible trading post names of families that were living there. Denashas, DeBro, Nakents, Thayer, Martin, Tainer, Jockey, Slater, Martell, Bellel. (4/11 of 1912), Indian Agent White insists with Flambeau Logging that Indians should retain their lake frontage after flooding of Chippewa River. And she talks about the mounds, the burial mounds, built for defensive and ceremonial purposes. The mounds located in Chippewa Indian country of the Chequamegon or Lake Superior region were built for defense and ceremonial purposes and by prehistoric beings, as is commonly supposed. They also built during the preserve old Indian parents or the parents themselves, and the memories of them are very vivid in the minds of the old Indians. Built for defensive purposes, stand today as mute reminders of early conflict between two great tribes, the Sioux and the Chippewa, for territorial conquests and establishment of boundaries. This is also written by my grandma Phyllis. Flooding of Pakwewang, 1921, the Northern States Power Company, a powerful corporation, wanted to construct a reservoir to build a dam that would control the flow of the Chippewa River downstream. This would benefit people in towns below the proposed dam, prevent seasonal floods, and provide electricity. Controversy has been going on for many years between the company officials and the Indians. This would mean flooding of many acres of tribal land at the post being Pakwewang, meaning where the river bends. It would also destroy bountiful rice beds, graves that were sacred to them, their homes and gardens, a place where they had been living in peace and contentment for many generations. Many of the post people were in their 70s and 80s, so having to move and leave their homes was very difficult. They were saddened at the thought, but despite their protest, they were forced to move. From what I remember from her telling us, she was about 3 years old, living in Old Post when they were forced to move. And here she says, I did not live at Old Post for long. I was only 3 years old at the time of the removal. All I know is what my foster mother, Mrs. Gus Martin, relayed to me when I was about 12 years. They said to compensate, NSP agreed to build them all new houses and move their many graves, both Catholic and pagan, to a new location. Many people wanted their family graves moved. The ones who didn't want their family graves disturbed, these would be left as they were. Catholic Church St. Anthony's was also abandoned, but it stood intact for many years. It was built on high grounds, as were a few other houses. Most of the people were of the Indian religion, Midwaywan. Many had been converted to the Catholic religion. My foster mother said when the graves were being dug up, people would go up on a hill to sit and watch. She also told me the condition of the remains as they were being removed. It would all be taken to the new site where they would be reburied. All the workers had to wear face masks as typhoid was prevalent at that time. NSP suggested building new homes for the post people at reserve, but they didn't want to move there. They wanted to live near the old place, Pakwewang. They chose a site 1 or 2 miles southwest to what today is New Post. Not all went to New Post. A few families moved to Round Lake, others to the west fork of the Chippewa River, which is Riverside. 2 houses were being built at the new location, 15 houses plus a store and a police station. The houses were made of green lumber as they had to be done as quickly as possible. Some had an upstairs, others didn't, but they were all constructed the same. Some people preferred to build their own homes. NSP supplied all the building material, lumber, doors, windows, etc. All this was stockpiled near where Bill DeBro was building his house, where it would be easy to access to all the building sites. When the homes were completed, the post people came by horse and wagon. They came up the hill by the present-day swimming beach. Everything they owned, which included furniture, household goods of all kinds, livestock, such as horses and chickens, were brought. Crossing the river, the horses could barely keep their heads above the water. Eventually, the people were all moved. In 1922, the dam was being built, and the tribe gave NSP a 50-year lease to control it. In 1923, the dam was completed. The gates closed. Posts, now the old post, soon sank beneath the water, giving way to the Chippewa flowage, Pakwewang, a long forgotten time and place. Below is something I read at one time that is a typical example of what the post Indians must have felt. To be expelled from their beautiful village where their ancestors were born, expelled from their hunting grounds, which for many generations had supplied them with wildlife, denied the last consolation that mingled their ashes with the dust of their ancestors, meant an outrage they couldn't accept. Untutored, the Indians were gravely injured, goaded on by such sickly recollections, crushing misery. After the post people moved to New Post, Indians on a reservation presented them with a sacred drum. They came to post with the drum and met in a field. The ones who brought the drum lined up on one side, the post Indians on the opposite side. They started to drum, and soon everyone joined in and danced. The drum was given into the safekeeping of two men from the post. Indians considered the drum sacred at that time and would never leave it. I wonder what became of this drum. I never heard. Probably in some non-Indian's private collection, perhaps in a museum somewhere. And she also wrote a couple of things that she would like to see. She said we should always remember and keep this memory alive by encouraging the tribal council and the traditional leaders to protect these islands by maintaining them as sacred burial grounds. Maybe permanent markers can be placed on church and pagan islands to that effect. These are known places where there are graves. This would be a historic part of the LCO reservation history. Hopefully this will become a reality someday. I remember every spring, my grandma would get us together, and Dale, Doreen, and whoever else wanted to go. And we would make our yearly pilgrimage down to Old Post. She wanted to look around, maybe dig a little bit. We did this every year until just about up until the time she passed away. When we first had the idea of doing a remembrance ceremony on the islands for the people of Old Post, even at that time, we thought, we don't want this to be a celebration. I mean, we wanted this to be a commemorative, a remembrance to the people and what they went through down there 100 years ago. So that's what we had in mind. We had Bodie LaRush cook for us out there. He cooked a big meal. And then we got a bunch of pontoons together, and we boated everybody out there that wanted to go. And that's what we did out there. The first time we did it, my grandma and Sammy Jockey were both alive, and they were the last two remaining survivors from Old Post. And the next year, we did the same thing, but a couple years later, Sammy passed away in that time. So we did it anyway. And this time we got a group of drummers and singers to go out with us. It was Doogie Wade and a few other guys. And when we brought my grandma out there, as we approached the island, we could hear the music. She could see everybody there. And she could hear the drumming and the singing. And as we pulled up to the dock that we set up, you could see tears coming down her eyes. You could see tears coming out of her eyes. She was really moved by that. She really liked that. And that's what we kind of want to do again this year is, I mean, there was talk about making it a big celebration and creation of the flowage, but we didn't see it that way. Remembering the stories and the pictures from my grandma, we wanted to do the same thing. We wanted to do make it a commemorative and a remembrance and an honor. And so that's what we're going to do in August. And if anybody wants to come out, just come on down and we'll get you out there. Thank you.
We have a couple other speakers here lined up. Rusty Barber.
Okay, I would just like to say, we were the ones walking around helping with the elders, grabbing food, and we just want to say one thing.
We just wanted to say a thank you to everyone who was donating the money to us, and we really appreciated it. And we raised like $1,000 today, so thank you.
Yay! Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Buzo and away Morgan Dung. Abertrunsten Shinakaz was assisted in Dodium. Go away, Gamug. Doing Jabba. Oma dollars a guy again. My name is Halfway, and I'm from the Bullhead clan, the Fish clan, and I live over here in Round Lake. And I'm glad to see that we have a good crowd tonight. This isn't a celebration, this is a remembrance of a tragedy amongst our people here on Odawazagayaganing. You know, as we look back on the history of our tribe, we had the lumber barons come in, Radisson and Weyerhaeuser and all these big name lumber companies that came in and took our lumber. Nobody was there to protect us, even though our headsmen from our villages protested against it. But they took our lumber. Then in the early 1900s, they start thinking about a hydro. Electricity was a big thing then. And Lacuta fell underneath the Bureau of Indian Affairs and was considered a whole group of a town. And so the surrounding communities start saying, well, we got to break it down. We don't want them to become a township. And so then they broke us up into 6 townships so we wouldn't have that voting. And that happened in between 1900 and 1910 or so. But in reality, they already went to the headsman, and the headsman said no, just like Rick said. We do not want this dam at all, none. And of course, they expressed their concerns. You know, what's going to happen to our wild rice? What's going to happen to our trapping? What's going to happen to our berries? What's going to happen to our livelihood? Well, they start cutting between 1912 and on up to 1923. And of course, we all know that we didn't become citizens of the United States until 1924. But somehow they were able to get enough headsmen to sign off to okay this dam. You know, and you look at the suffering of our people, and we look at what we're trying to do here tonight. And I thank Tim for remembering out on the island, Church Island, to start to remember, giving our young people a grasp of what happened here to our ancestors, our relatives, our grandmas, our grandpas, great-grandmas. Reality. You know, a lot of the stuff you read in the history books of what happened in the West or what happened in the East. But I look at us here, what we went through. And we look at the dam when it went above the high water mark. And just think, I'm just want to add this in a little bit. What's happening to the polar caps now in the north and in the south? Melting. And what are they warning about? The ocean's going to rise and it's going to come in. So I think that kind of ironic, maybe not in our lifetime, but your kids' future will be talking about the same things. We could have stopped it somehow. You know, but I just wanted to add that much. But my main theme that I want to talk about tonight is how we came together. And I think we've lost a lot of that in our relations and who was impacted in a new post area and how we become related. Gosh, the James, the Smiths, the Frogs, the Clouds, the Carrolls, the Bakers, Homeskies. There's a lot of them that, when that water came up and flooded all these other areas just out of New Post, but all the way up that Chippewa River there. And Tim and them live up on there, near there. But when you look at, we're related to the James. My grandfather, Bill Barber, his sister, Agnes Barber, was married to Henry Smith. And that's how we're related on side. We're related to the Clouds and Chief Lake because my grandmother's mother was a Cloud. And Susie Kagagaby was a Cloud. And I believe Lucy Begay's mother was a Cloud. They were sisters. And my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, John Frog, was married to Elizabeth. And at that time, they lived up on the Chippewa River, not too far from Dooney Thayer's, where Dooney Thayer lives over that way. And when I got out of the service in 1996, I got to talk to her and I asked her a little bit about that. And she was just a young child also. But they weren't impacted immediately. New Post got flooded up when it started coming up. And finally, she just realized that everything was being loaded up into a horse and wagon. And that evening, they took off from Chippewa down into Round Lake. And she remembers riding through the night, and she can remember the lantern swinging back and forth. And she was in there with whatever household goods they had and straw, and she was covered with a blanket. And there was uncertainty where they're going to go. Yeah, they're coming into Round Lake, and that's where the sisters come in. The Kagagabys and the Clouds and the Carrolls. And they had a relative living right down on Round Lake there where Carolyn Naknaby is living right now. There was an old two-story house there that her mother lived in there. And right next to that, there was an old church. And so when they came down, they opened their home up, and that's where they got to stay until they built a log cabin down the road where Sam used to live. And then my grandmother, John Frog, and Elizabeth moved into the church. And here we talked about the religion, the Medewan religion and the Catholic religions, how they clashed, you know, and come to find out that John Frog's wife was related to the Carrolls, and he didn't like. Anyway, there was a big squabble there. But anyway, you know, that's the way it was back then too. You know, you had these and this and that. But you know, when you look at all these relatives that opened their homes up to people that were being displaced. You know, and our children have to understand that, and I hope that we have more of this to be taught, not just here in Lakota Ray, but also under Act 31 out in Hayward and the surrounding communities of what happened here. Okay, and where's Ward Winton? Is he here somewhere? Oh, there, yeah, and so he was part of that. I believe his grandfather was part of, wasn't that correct, Rick? You know, and so that's all I'm going to say. I've been up here long enough jabbering away, but we come together. We're all related. And that circle that we have to do is teach our children who we're related to. Okay, and then we can find out these stories as we come along. Don't keep these stories to yourself. Talk to people. Let them know. Because they're going to have to carry on our history into the future. My God, it's what, 2023 already? You know, boy, we got a lifetime to teach it, however long that lifetime is. So, miigwech.
Julie is going to save some things about the Nicates.
Good evening again. Okay, well, I am from the Nikens family. We had my great-grandfather, Nikes, didn't have an English name, that was his name. And he had 80 acres. He had 2 lots back there, I think it was north of Pakwewang. Yeah, Pokegama. No, it was Pakwewang. Anyway, well, a lot of his land was flooded and they had to move also, you know, with everyone else. And I'm just wondering what happened to that land, you know, that they flooded, and they moved them all to New Post and put them in a little bitty house. What happened to their acreage is what I want to know. And another thing that I want to know is, do they still call Pagan Island Pagan Island? And I would like that changed, because we are Medewan and we are Anishinaabe, we are Catholic, but I think what we are number one first is Anishinaabe. And we had a lot of people there that were Medewan. I'm Medewan now. We have a lot of people in here Medewan. That was our traditional way, and it's still alive. And I kind of resent being called that. In that word, it means not of their religion, you know, but to me, it's not, it doesn't sound good. So I would like to request from somebody to change that name of that island out there. And yeah, it really is a sad situation that our families had to come forward after this tragic flooding of our lands. And like everyone said, we lost rice beds, we lost medicine, we lost our trees that provided air for us. Uju, I'm back. Anyway, okay, well, I don't know how I got, I just raised my hand to talk a little bit about my family at a meeting, and so here I am. And it's been really a good thing that we were able to do this. And like I said, I want to thank the creator and everyone else involved in putting this together for our people in remembrance of the people that we lost back there in Old Post. And again, I want to say, miigwech to Gitchimanadu, language. Meet you.
Thank you, Julie. Folks, to thank for putting this together tonight, and I look around the room and I got to mention our church was very active this morning at St. Ignatius, and they had a commemoration service there this morning at 9 o'clock, and as we walked over to the cemetery, and they put a lot of work into that. I'm forgetting the name of our new father out at the church. Haroon. Thank you. And our father from Hayward is also here with us today, and Miigwech. And Sister Felissa and Sister Mary Rose. They're back. There they are. Good. I want to make sure that Faith Smith gets the recognition that she's due. She's put a lot of work into this. And folks, she's also planning a big commemoration this summer. On July 24th, 21st, we're going to have a commemoration event, a real large one, there in New Post at the stone building, the historic stone building. So we'll be there. We're going to have a big circus tent there in case we have rain. And you know what it's like on July 24th. We could have some thunder boomers there. We're going to have some pontoon boats for rides. We're going to be doing, we're going to have Ward Winton III back again. He was here earlier. And his grandfather, of course, was the attorney for the tribe back in 1919. And I just really appreciate everybody coming out. As I look around the room, I see a lot of relatives here who are, as was mentioned by Rusty, everyone's related here. And if you look into the genealogy, you'll see it. So our heart is with everyone today, and the people who lived up in that riverway up there that lost a lot of their property and their belongings and just everything. It was so bad. But we're going to look forward. And again, on July 21st, we have this commemoration event in New Post. On August 12th, we're going to have a recognition out at Church Island. And we'll have boats and things out there. We'll let you know what's coming up. We're going to make sure that everybody knows about the 100th year anniversary of this event. Badger Singers, please close out with a traveling song. Good night, safe travels. Miigwech.